So in our previous video, we did focus on the Song Dynasty, but it was more about continuities, things that stayed the same between the Song and the previous Tang Dynasty. And we also covered the notion of the mandate of heaven, as in what gives each dynasty the right to rule. Today, in this particular video, we begin with looking at innovation, as in things that changed. Now, the period from 900 to 1300 is often referred to as a commercial revolution. It begins with the fact that northern farmers tended to grow wheat and millet. Those were the two primary crops, wheat and millet, because they got less rain. Southern farmers grew rice because they received more rainfall. Now, southern China had been viewed as somewhat of a backwater with all of their swamps that bred malaria. But then northerners moved in and they actually drained the swamps in search of more land. Because again, northerners moved south with the shift of the capital to evade the nomads. They began searching for land. And they would regulate the flow of water into the fields, plant the seeds in gardens, and then they'd transplant the rice plants into drained fields and flood them when the time was right. Now, the innovation with champa rice was that it was more drought resistant. Not only is it drought resistant, it had a shorter growing season than other strains of rice. So now, all of a sudden, if you have champa rice as part of your crop, you can plant and harvest 2 crops per year instead of just 1. The result, we see pop boom. The result is a population jump from about 50 to 60 million under the Tang to 120 by 1200 under the Song Dynasty. Urbanization becomes, I guess you could call it a thing, so to speak. China becomes the most urbanized country in the world, not even close. There were about 500,000 people in the city of Chang'an at its peak. All right, so Chang'an was a capital under the Tang, and it declines when the capital moves to Guangzhou. And Guangzhou, as you can see, had 1 million at its peak. There are numerous cities that have a population of over 100,000, which is really unheard of in the European world at this time. Guangzhou is extremely cosmopolitan, and it's really along the same lines of Constantinople and Baghdad. You've got actors performing in the streets. You have restaurants catering to different cuisines and different tastes. There were inns that served wine, and some were considered to be unfit for polite company. Realistically, Guangzhou is probably the most advanced city in the world at this time. The empire is linked by extensive waterways. So canals, rivers and lakes is what we mean by that. Transportation is relatively cheap and easy. Now, there are about 30,000 miles of waterway, and the main Song contribution to the Grand Canal. We get kind of an image of this Grand Canal here that linked north and south. Was a system of locks that prevented barges from running into each other with roofs for protection. Additionally, the pound locks that prevent barges from running into each other. Additionally, they used knowledge of the stars to innovate the compass. So directional travel is a bit easier, and they invented the junk ship. Junk is a ship that has watertight bulkheads and stern-mounted rudders. The Persians are actually going to copy these designs. And there's even parts of this Grand Canal that you can still traverse today. State-run factories and backyard steel furnaces are going to churn out iron. And by the 11th century, they are producing about 32,000 suits of armor, 16 million iron arrowheads, and metal coins, tools, and bells for Buddhist monasteries. Coal is also going to be widely used. It's used to heat homes and for cooking. So there were some environmental issues that came along with this particular innovation. And even though merchants are frowned upon within traditional Confucian society, because if you look at the hierarchy of Chinese society, merchants are at the bottom. They're viewed as taking advantage of people. But the government can no longer completely control trade, and they do lose their monopoly on regulating business. As a result, merchants will receive the opportunity to now make an economic fortune. It's the same way that the scholarly gentry and government officials can make bank. Land no longer becomes the only source of wealth. So the traditional hierarchies based on agricultural economies become weakened. So when we look at East Asia, specifically China, these are the innovations. When we look at additional continuities, in the last video, the continuities were more government-based. Culturally speaking, there's a continuity of what's called filial piety. Now, filial piety is the respect that one holds for their parents. And it's a cornerstone of the teachings of Confucius. It was believed that if children obeyed their parents and their ruler followed the teachings of Confucius, problems within the country would right themselves. And you can see a quote here. At home, a young man must respect his parents. Abroad, he must respect his elders, straight out of Confucius. And with that, Neo-Confucianism, New Confucianism, it arises around the year 1000 and becomes very prominent under the Song and eventually the Ming. The belief is that students should examine everything in the world around them to determine what the patterns are. From understanding patterns, they can attain what's called sagehood. You acquire wisdom. It takes the emphasis away from strict ritual and the inner humanity that Confucius himself had stressed. So Neo-Confucianism stresses the need to look for and understand patterns. Now, when we look at the role of women in the north under the Tang Dynasty, many Chinese women are influenced by nomads from the steppes, and they placed far fewer restrictions on their women. Elite women were active in social life. They rode horses. And the dominance of Confucianism under the Song is a reaction to the economic changes that occur. There's a great shift in society, an agricultural revolution, the rise of merchants. And anytime there's a quick shift, there's somewhat of a backlash culturally to try and deal with this, to try and slow things down. Now, women will learn to read, but by and large, they are going to learn to read the Confucian passages that emphasize the subordinate role of women. That's kind of the rationale behind teaching women to read under the Song Dynasty. And the education that women receive are going to make for more desirable matches for prospective husbands. Women do have some degree of control over financial matters while their merchant husbands are away, but property ownership automatically passes to her husband. And if their husband divorces them or dies, they're not allowed to remarry. We see the term foot binding here. Now, it begins under the Tang with court dancers, but soon it seeps into elite Chinese society under the Song. Now, under the Song, it does get more accepted. The idea is you take a young girl, age 5 to 6, tightly wrap her feet, you break the bones of the toes multiple times until they set and they're placed in lotus shoes. Now, one of the reasons for this was it was seen as separating the so-called enlightened Chinese from the barbarians to the north. So for thousands of, more like, hundreds of years, this was viewed as a way for an elite Chinese girl to obtain status and be viewed as beautiful. This wasn't outlawed until 1912, when the last Chinese dynasty fell and China becomes a republic. But it continues in the interior of China into the 1930s. And the last factory that manufactured lotus shoes wasn't closed until 1999. So this is still, unfortunately, somewhat of a recent continuity. With industry shifts, traditionally women would tend to silkworms and they would weave silk thread at home. But state factories and workshops in the cities took over this task. Women still could be small business owners in the cities, and they worked as domestic servants, and they would sometimes serve as entertainers, courtesans, or concubines. They were allowed to somewhat control their own dowries and inherit property, but again, it transfers to their husband upon marriage. So some shifts under the song, but many cultural continuities are going to remain, along with the various innovations that occur.